All right, so we are here at the carbon cycle. Here is the picture from the book. The original caption on this book says, carbon dioxide gas exists in the atmosphere as CO2 and is dissolved in the water as carbonic acid. Photosynthesis converts carbon dioxide to organic carbon, and respiration cycles organic carbon back into carbon dioxide gas. Long-term storage of organic carbon occurs when matter from living organisms is buried deep underground and becomes fossilized. Volcanic activity and more recently human emissions bring this stored carbon back into the carbon cycle, which is very, very wordy, probably a pretty good summary of the chapter, but let's maybe break this up a little bit. Let's talk about some of the details. So the first thing is the biological carbon cycle that we are all part of. And basically what's happening at the most zoomed out level is that heterotrophs are taking atmospheric carbon in the form of CO2, or if they live in the oceans, in the form of carbonic acid, which is CO2 that's been dissolved in water. And they're converting that CO2 along with energy harnessed from the sun into sugars. And so they're storing that energy. They're storing that energy in the bonds between these carbons. And the process of photosynthesis is taking carbon, it's taking some water and some energy from the sun, and it is making this molecule here. Okay, so that is sort of the way in which inorganic carbon, inorganic compounds can be converted into something that is used biologically. So photosynthesis allows plants to take CO2 or take CO2 that's been dissolved in water, aka carbonic acid, and convert it into glucose. And the reason that's important is because we eat that. Heterotrophs eat autotrophs that have made sugars, and we use it for our own metabolic processes. Okay, so heterotrophs eat autotrophs and break down their higher energy glucose through the process of respiration to obtain cellular energy, which is generally in the form of ATP. So aerobic respiration also, there's another component to this. The most efficient form of respiration, or the easiest way to take these glucose molecules and turn them into energy, is called aerobic respiration. And aerobic respiration requires oxygen. So what's happening is these autotrophs are creating glucose from carbon dioxide and water, but one of the byproducts of that creation is also they're making oxygen as well. They're releasing oxygen as a waste product of photosynthesis. And so basically plants are saying, hey, I need a way to get energy from the environment. And a really great way to get that energy is to grab carbon dioxide and then convert it into sugar. When they convert that carbon dioxide into sugar, they're releasing oxygen as a chemical byproduct. Plants are going to use this glucose too. They're not just making it for you and me. Plants they're taking and making glucose, and then they're using respiration as well to make ATP for themselves. But we're eating these sugars and we're using them to make ATP for ourselves. And in order to do that, we need oxygen, which is also released by plants during the process of photosynthesis. Kind of really interesting, cool stuff. So gas exchange to the atmosphere and water is one way that the carbon cycle really sort of connects all living organisms on the planet. Okay, they're absorbing carbon dioxide, they're making glucose, they're making oxygen, both of which we need to survive. So we also have this idea of the biogeochemical carbon cycle, which generally happens much more slowly than the biological carbon cycle. Carbon is usually, in the biogeochemical cycle, it's usually stored in carbon reservoirs in places like the atmospheres, in oceans, dissolved as calcium carbonate in ocean sediments, in soils, and rocks, and importantly, it's stored in the form of fossil fuels in the Earth's, and it's stored in the Earth's interior. So CO2 in the atmosphere is a huge reservoir, and obviously, as I just stated, we need it for photosynthesis. Like I was saying before, it's going to dissolve in the water and turn into those CaCO3, those calcium carbonate ions, and those are going to be used by a lot of marine organisms to create their shells, amongst other things. Not just marine organisms, many organisms make their shells out of carbon. And these organisms eventually form sediments when they die on the ocean floor. And so that's one place, that is one reservoir for carbon. Eventually, over many millions of years, the calcium carbonate is going to form limestone, which is going to make up, limestone in the ocean forms the largest carbon reservoir on the planet. It's not the only carbon reservoir, certainly on land. Carbon is stored in soils because living things die and decompose and become part of the soil again. Also, rock breaking down some of the carbon that was stored there winds up getting stored in soils. If you keep going deeper underground, we wind up having fossil fuels. If you drill far enough, you'll find oil. Not everywhere, but you will eventually find oil and coal from the Carboniferous period. And what we do is we take those fossil fuels and we light them on fire and we use them to run our cars. And this is problematic for a few reasons. For one thing, these are non-renewable. The rate at which fossil fuels form as a reservoir for carbon is much slower than the rate at which we are able to use them. So this is a fundamentally non-renewable resource. And I'm going to have a slide about that later on. We have other ways. We have ways in which, so that's sort of a couple of ways in which carbon can go from the atmosphere to be stored on land in these reservoirs. There are ways in which carbon can go from the land back to the atmosphere, like by burning fossil fuels, for instance. We also have things like volcanoes going off that take carbon directly from land reservoirs back into the atmosphere. And basically what's happening is carbon sediments, all the carbon that's stored on the ocean floor is being subducted into the earth. And ultimately when you have a volcanic, I don't know what the term is, I'm not a geologist, an eruption, when you have a volcanic eruption, that carbon is being shot back. Another problem that we have is that the food that we like to eat has a major carbon impact. And so one of the really bad animals to raise for this is cows. The reason for this is that cows eat a lot of food, they drink a lot of water, and they fart out a lot of methane, and their excrement is filled with disgusting gases that get released back into the atmosphere, which are really bad for everyone. So let's just look here for a second. One way that you can get carbon from the atmosphere back to the land is the air-sea gas exchange, which again is carbon dioxide getting dissolved into ocean water. And then you have marine photosynthesis from that calcium carbonate. Okay, so there's some marine photosynthesis here, which is sequestering carbon. It's turning it into sugar. You have the opposite of that process, which is taking the sugar and turning it into energy, but carbon is released from this as well. Same process happening with terrestrial photosynthesis, but instead of being calcium carbonate, it's absorbing just CO2. Like I talked about earlier, the weathering of rocks and the exchange of human emissions, just putting a ton of CO2 back into the atmosphere. As you can see here, here's sort of the start of the Industrial Revolution, and our carbon emissions have just very much so exploded in the past 100, 150 or so or so years. So carbon is a very big deal. Again, it is the component of your 4 biomolecules: nucleic acids, proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. It's right in the word carbo. Anyway, carbon, the carbon cycle is super important. It has major impacts on things like global climate change. It is, plants converting carbon into glucose is the reason that you're able to do metabolism. It's the reason that you're able to live. And the byproduct of that, oxygen, is the reason that you're able to breathe. So carbon, really big deal. Next, we're going to be talking about nitrogen and the nitrogen cycle.